Coming up next on Arizona Horizon, a warning that climate change will bring a variety of disasters sooner than previously thought. And we'll hear from an Arizona congressional candidate. Those stories and more next on Arizona Horizon.
Arizona Horizon is made possible with the support of Arizona Highways Magazine, Escape, Explore, Experience, and by APS, working 24/7 to keep Arizona on, and by the contributions from the Friends of 8, members of your Arizona PBS station.
Good evening and welcome to Arizona Horizon. I'm Ted Simons. Longtime Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction and gubernatorial candidate Carolyn Warner died Tuesday night of cancer. She was 88. Warner served 12 years as the state's education chief back in the 1970s and 80s. She ran unsuccessfully for U.S. Senate in 1976 and lost to Evan Mecham in a three-way race for governor in 1986. Warner joined us here on Arizona Horizon earlier this year to talk about her autobiography titled Before I Forget. Warner remembered starting in politics at a very young age.
I started politics when I was 11, and one of the congressmen from my grandparents' district, his name was Victor Wickersham, and he was running for Congress, of course, every 2 years. And so he said, "Well, you little girl, would you like to hand out my cards?" And I was thrilled, so I did. And then 2 years later, a fellow who was running for governor named Roy Turner asked if I would speak for him. And I was very young. I couldn't drive a car, so my mother would have to drive me from one courthouse to another to speak. And I started making political speeches way back then.
That little girl in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
did she ever see where you're sitting right now? Did she ever envision that?
One of my mentors was a man named Robert S. Kerr. He was a senator from Oklahoma. I think he had expected me, well, he told me that he expected me to be the first woman governor of Oklahoma. And of course, that I thought was just pie in the sky. But no, I had not expected that.
Carolyn Warner, dead at 88. A recently released climate change report says that governments and individuals must make quick action to avoid disastrous changes due to global warming. The report suggests that those troubling changes could be a reality earlier than previously forecast. Joining us now is Daniel Bodansky from ASU's O'Connor College of Law. He's a leading authority on global climate change law. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
What do we make of this? This is a UN report on climate change, somewhat alarming here.
Yeah, it's the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been doing these reports now for over 20 years. And it's the latest wake-up call. There have been a lot of wake-up calls already, but this is the latest one saying that basically even if we hold temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, which is the most aggressive number that people are considering, even that would have pretty significant adverse consequences. It would be a lot better than 2 degrees, which was the previous goal, but it would still be serious.
It says that we have until 2030 to avoid disastrous warming levels. In other words, that 1.5 degrees, we're talking Celsius here, what is that, 2.7 Fahrenheit, something like that?
Yes.
So 2.7 Fahrenheit, if you get there in 2030, the report says really bad things are going to happen.
Yeah, so what the report says is tries to lay out a pathway as to if we want to keep temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, which is really about the best we can do at this point, what will we need to do to get there? And what we need to do is cut emissions by about 50% by 2030 and cut emissions to zero by 2050. So we'd have to go from where we are now to zero emissions net between now and 2050.
Is that even remotely realistic?
So one of the things the report was supposed to look at, it was supposed to look at two things. First of all, what's the relative consequences of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees? And then it was also supposed to look at, can we actually get to 1.5 degrees? Is that a realistic goal? And they said, yes, we can get to 1.5 degrees. It would require dramatic changes. So I think it would require turning on a dime, essentially, from where we're going right now to where we would need to go.
And you're mentioning, 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already warmed to 1 degree since the start of the industrial age. We should mention that. We're already at 1 degree higher.
That's right. So we're only talking about a half degree more. So what they're saying is 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We've increased by 1, as you say. So we have a half degree more to go. And that's why, basically, if we keep on emitting the way we're emitting right now, by 2030, we will have used up the entire carbon budget to get there. So we'll have baked in at 1.5 degrees or more for sure.
At 1 degree right now, Celsius, again, before the industrial age, are we seeing the consequences?
I think we're already seeing the consequences. There was a heat wave a number of years ago in Paris that I think most people attribute in part to climate change that killed 30,000 people. We've seen more and more frequent hurricanes and more intense hurricanes, like the one we just had in Florida. So I think we're already seeing the consequences. So it's already doing bad things already, but it's going to be a lot worse at 1.5 degrees.
So at 1.0, we're seeing this. At 1 point, it sounds like it's exponentially bad as each degree increases. Is that fair?
So I'm not sure it's exponential, but I mean it definitely gets. We're in a very steep curve. So as it goes from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, the negative consequences are a lot worse. They're more than 2 times as bad.
My God. Okay, so some of the consequences: more heat waves, extreme drought. More wildfires, more extreme rain, floods, greater sea levels increases, right. and as a part and parcel of all that, food shortages. All that makes sense to you?
Yeah, well, as the Earth warms, the ocean expands and there's sea level rise, there's changes in the circulation, so that leads to more droughts and also more extreme weather events, so things like hurricanes. And then also it is going to change the pattern of where species are located and probably lead to the extinction of some species. The species that will be most affected are insects, which are key for pollination and for agriculture. So, so there are a lot of negative consequences of all sorts.
So what do we do? They're calling for changes in energy, in industry, in buildings, in transportation. Right. What should, because again, this horse has kind of left the barn, hasn't it? I mean, we should have been doing some of this stuff 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, so I mean, the earlier you take action, the easier it is to get to the goal. And so and the longer you wait, the harder it is to change course in time to avert, disastrous climate change. So the longer we wait, the worse the problem becomes. Yeah, we should have taken action 10 years ago. Better to take action now than 10 years from now. And by 10 years from now, we won't be looking at 1.5 degrees anymore. We'll be looking at 2, 3. If we don't, I think the predictions are if we don't change course at all, we're looking at probably more than 3 degrees increase. So, double.
So what do we do? What do we do with buildings? What do we do with transportation? What are some of the ideas out there?
Well, so there are a lot of different things one can do. I think one of the keys is fuel switching, so moving from fossil fuels to renewable fuels and nuclear, zero-emitting fuels. That's probably the most important one. Energy efficiency, having more fuel-efficient cars, for example, more efficient buildings. And then changes in agricultural practices. It really, one of the things that makes it such a challenging problem is virtually every human activity emits gases that contribute to the problem. So it's not just a matter of energy policy or transportation policy, it's also agricultural policy, urban planning across the board.
Can science and technology, for lack of a better phrase, bail us out of this?
Well, that would be nice if it happened. I don't think we should be counting on that because there is a lot of technological change, and it's making renewables a lot cheaper. It's bringing in more efficient cars and electric cars. So I think there are a lot of technological changes. The question is the rate of technology change going to be fast enough to lead to these very, very dramatic changes in emissions? And I don't think you can count on that. You really need some kind of government policies that helps drive the technologies and also drives people to adopt the technologies.
You also need cooperation between governments. That has to be a concern as well. I mean, you can't have China over there with skies you can barely see across the street in, and we're all solar over here. I mean, you've got to have some cooperation.
Yeah, so what I work on primarily is the international dimension of this. So it's the negotiating agreements to try to get not just the U.S. to be taking action, but the rest of the world. And one of the huge advances in the latest agreement, the Paris Agreement, which President Trump has said he's going to back out of, is that it not only involves Western industrialized countries, it also involves the big developing countries like China and India. So that was a huge advance over the previous agreements that have been negotiated.
Can those, if the United States doesn't want to get involved, okay, but can the other countries that were involved still band together and do something about this?
Yeah, so one of the questions when President Trump announced that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement was, would other countries use this as an excuse to pull out too? And so far we haven't seen that happen. Other countries are staying in the Paris Agreement and maintaining their commitments. So that hasn't happened yet. I think the longer the U.S. doesn't take action, the harder it becomes for the rest of the world to be acting. So I think over the long term it will have a negative consequence. But right now, other countries are keeping their commitments under Paris.
So I guess the bottom line here is that it's bad, it's getting worse, and what, you just try and pump the brakes a little bit?
Got to do the best you can. So you really, I think it's action on all fronts. So it's individuals can do things that will help. Buy different kinds of cars, drive less, have more efficient homes, and so forth and so on. Local governments and states in the U.S. are acting. So as the U.S. national government has sort of stepped back and not doing as much, states like California are doing a lot more to deal with the problem. There's a lot of cities now that have climate change plans in place. And then it requires national action, which in the U.S. we're going in the wrong direction, at least in my opinion. And then you also need international action. So you need action really sort of all fronts. It's all hands on deck.
Yeah, I was going to say until 20. Okay, interesting information. Good to have you here. Daniel Badansky from ASU. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And up next on Arizona Horizon, we will meet a candidate for Arizona's 4th Congressional District.
For the past 8 months, we've been delighted to bring my show Amanpour to PBS. Now I am thrilled with our new show Amanpour and Company. I'm really looking forward to working with our incredibly talented contributors. Join us for Amanpour and Company.
Weeknights at midnight on Arizona PBS.
Our coverage of election 2018 continues tonight as we interview David Brill, a Democrat running against Republican Representative Paul Gosar in Arizona's 4th Congressional District. We should note that Gosar declined an offer to participate in a debate, so we welcome David Brill to Arizona Horizon. Good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Who are you? Where'd you come from? Tell us about yourself.
I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm the son of a minister, a Methodist minister. And one of the things that I like is that I grew up, he loved to work across the aisle in spirituality. He would meet on Mondays with with rabbis, priests, and so on. But I grew up going to breakfast meetings on Mondays where he would just work with them, and I really enjoyed that growing up. So I want to do that and work across the aisle. But I was a high school history teacher before I became a doctor, and then I started 3 small businesses.
Okay, you are running against a veteran congressman in a heavily Republican district. Why?
Because he's been neglecting the district for the past 8 years while he's been there. He enjoys grandstanding. He takes extreme views on various things. And while he's doing that, the folks in our district have not gotten affordable health care. He's been in Congress for 8 years, and he hasn't lifted a finger to help Medicare negotiate with pharmaceutical companies on price. He hasn't helped to get teachers in our schools, and he hasn't helped to get broadband in our rural areas so that our schools can give a 21st century education to their children, and so that our kids can start businesses in rural areas instead of having to move to Phoenix to start businesses. We need our kids to be able to be entrepreneurs in rural areas.
You mentioned on your website that the cut and spend approach of diminished government is not serving citizens in the district well. Explain, please.
Well, when Congressman Gosar was elected in 2010, he said that he was going to shrink the debt of the federal government. Instead, he's increased it. It's now $21 trillion. That's 7 piles of $1 bills going from here to the moon. And most of that is going to be paid by our children because he's given big tax breaks to billionaires, and every tax break we give to a billionaire is going to have to be paid by the children in our district.
Republicans will say that the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts that you're referring to there, they jump-started the economy and we're zooming right now, and you can thank those tax cuts for a lot of it. You say
the economy was moving and getting closer to booming well before those tax cuts hit. And we'll see where the economy goes now, but it's looking a little bit shaky at the moment.
So when your opponent says get government out of the way, repeal nonsensical regulations, and lower taxes, again, you respond how?
Well, I'm a businessman, so getting rid of regulations that don't make sense, I absolutely support it. And some of the regulations that really don't make sense are having the handcuffs on Medicare to not be able to negotiate on price with pharmaceutical companies. That would be deregulation, to let Medicare negotiate on prices. And it would also be deregulation if we let Medicare bring in Canadian pharmaceuticals made by the same pharmaceutical manufacturers that we have here. That would be deregulation. I like deregulation.
I want to get to health care in a second here, but one more point regarding the economy. You are quoted as saying, let's make sure that those who've benefited the most pay their fair share.
That's right.
What does that mean? Well,
let's look at, we have given the largest transfer of wealth in human history over the past 40 years to the top 1% of our population. They have taken 80% of the new wealth created over the past 30 years, the top 10%. They have made that money off of our infrastructure. And our infrastructure includes roads, education, Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, everything that it takes for us to live and thrive as families. That's part of the infrastructure. They've made that money off the infrastructure. It's only fair for them to pay more.
Do you think residents of that congressional district like to hear that kind of talk?
Some do and some don't, obviously, because some feel that, the taxes that we have now are fair. But I would have to say that we had great financial times when we did have higher tax rates. But here's a question I'd like to put out. So I'm a small businessman. We all know, we all agree, small businesses create about 80% of jobs. So why aren't we giving the tax breaks to small businesses instead of billionaires? Because it's the large corporations aren't the ones creating the jobs. They say there's going to be trickle down, but it doesn't work that way.
Do you think your opponent supports tax breaks for large businesses as opposed to small?
He has, yes.
So you believe you believe he thinks that's a good thing?
Yes, he's done it. That's what he did in December of 2017.
Health care. You are pro-public option, correct?
Correct.
What does a public option mean, and why do you support it?
Well, it doesn't mean single payer. And here's what I mean by that. If we tried to have single payer health care, where Medicare was forced upon everybody, mandated, we would have a revolt on the right. And I don't believe the Supreme Court would allow it to happen anyway, because they, in 2012, said that the federal government couldn't impose Medicaid on the states. So I support Medicare being voluntary, an option, where people, struggling Republican, Independent, or other families can opt into it, can buy it, and let it compete. Let it go in full tilt competition with the private sector. I really like competition.
But how can a private company compete with a government-backed entity? I mean, it seems counterintuitive.
Well, one part is profit margins. Another is having sensible management of care so that you don't have armies of people denying care. And another is, well, let's face it, there are some excesses that in healthcare that for insurance companies that, such as golf courses that are owned by the CEO. You don't see that in the public sector.
When you say
so maybe it makes sense to just have the public sector and the private sector go head to head and see which makes sense for our country.
When you say profit margin, are you saying that some of these insurance companies need a smaller profit margin, could live with a smaller profit margin?
Well, yes.
Do you think the residents of your district support that kind of talk?
I think the residents of our district really need some good health care. And if anybody has a better option, I'm sure waiting to hear it, because the Affordable Care Act has now been sabotaged so that it's not working well for anybody. And we hear a lot of people saying, going into the blame game, it's their fault, it's their fault. I like to be in the center and not on the extremes of politics. I say America before party, but what I haven't heard, we have a party that controls the Congress and the presidency. What is their plan? We've never heard a plan from them. So I would say that Medicare as an option is the only option, and it's a simple option for everybody.
But will the public option expand choice. If you've got enough firms that they don't want that smaller profit margin, they've got to have a profit times 3 or they're out of here. We've seen that with the Affordable Care Act. If they don't get what they want, they're gone. If the public option has you competing against a government entity, why as a private firm would I not say, I'm going to go make widgets, I'm out of this business, and there goes your option?
We'll see how they go, but Medicare is a paying system which allows choice within healthcare. So for instance, I also support Medicare being available to veterans. The Choice Act for veterans, you remember that Bernie and Senator McCain put through $18 billion, doesn't work very well. I've been at the VA for 10 years as a doctor. And what I've seen is that it's micromanaged, it causes delays, and it makes veterans travel too much. I think veterans have earned the right to have Medicare in addition to the VA, and let them use Medicare to get into the community locally quickly to see specialists, and then let the VA compete. So if veterans want to take their Medicare dollars and use them at the VA, that's their choice. They get to do that if they want to, but they also, the VA will have to up its customer service in order to compete for those dollars.
Why not up the schematic and just have a more market-based solution? That's what your opponent wants. He wants a more market-based system.
We've got a reasonably market-based system now, and his main ideas have been to let insurance companies cross state lines, which pharmaceutical companies already do, and where does that get us? And to have health savings account. And my question is, if you've got a family that's making $35,000 a year and they have a health saving account of $1,000, how is that going to protect them from a $50,000 medical bill?
Do you believe that we have an immigration crisis in America? Your opponent does. Do you?
We need security at the border, and we can certainly have that with walls, not one big wall, but walls and electronic security. And yes, I have to say that President Trump has been deporting quite a few people, and I think that the immigration issue there, from a competition point of view, is getting under control from a safety point of view for our citizens, and our citizens need to be safe. But for me, the immigration issue is one about solving the problem. And I think that what we need are more visas. And this is a great idea that came to me from the Cato Institute, which is, of course, a libertarian organization.
Yes.
I believe that great ideas are not a monopoly of any party. So I was having some drinks in Washington a few weeks ago with a gentleman from the Cato Institute, and he expressed a great idea. He said, if we have commuters crossing the border daily, or we have seasonal visas, which we need, or we have longer-term visas, whenever someone comes across the border and works in our country, they pay into a refundable bond with each paycheck, so that when their visa is up, they collect that bond and go home and buy a house for their family. But the key is that half of the undocumented people in this country are here because they overstayed their visas. So this would help them to not overstay their visas.
What about a path to citizenship for those who are here?
I think for the DACA children have really earned a path to citizenship.
What about those not?
I think that needs to be evaluated on an individual basis for each person and each family, and I think we need to fund more federal judges after we've stabilized the border and gotten our visas under control, because I know from speaking with the growers in Yuma, they want 35,000 commuter visas, and they don't have enough visas to have people harvesting the crops.
Supporting any path to citizenship for some, I would imagine, including your opponent, is akin to amnesty. You agree?
No, absolutely not. Because what I'm talking about is that each person is evaluated by a judge on whether they merit staying in this country. That's what I'm talking about. That is not amnesty.
Real quickly, we talked about climate change in our last segment. Your opponent says it's a false science and a false ideology. What say you?
I'm sorry, I'm a scientist. I'm a trained doctor. It is science, and it is good science, and the world agrees with that. We're watching our temperatures go up every year. Some people are calling it a prolonged drought. Some people are starting to wonder whether this is a drought or whether it's going to continue in this way. Whatever it is, I think it's only prudent for us as a country and as a planet to plan for the worst and deal with it, rather than keeping our head in the sand.
Last question. We've only got about 30 seconds left, so you've got to keep it quick here.
Yeah.
Are you too liberal for this district?
I'm rather centrist. If you look at our platform, and I invite everybody to go to our website, brillforcongress.com, check it out. But no, I am not too liberal for this district. This district is actually a bit bluer than many people may think.
All right, David Brill, Democratic candidate for Congressional District 4. Good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
And thank you.
And Friday on Arizona Horizon, we'll follow the money to see which political races are getting the most attention. And we'll preview Monday's U.S. Senate debate to be held here on Arizona PBS. That's on the Journalists Roundtable. And that is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thanks so much for joining us. You have a great evening.
Horizon is made possible with the support of Arizona Highways Magazine, for people inspired to enjoy Arizona's unique outdoor experience, and by APS, working 24/7 to keep Arizona on. Support for Arizona PBS comes from viewers like you and from
When you cast your vote in the upcoming election, you connect with issues that hit close to home. Clean Elections provides voter resources and tools